you all for coming today. I'm so glad you all were able to make it. So, just kind of an overview again of what this club is and why we're here. We at Reasonable Faith we try to explore an evidence-based Christianity. But this involves looking at the historical, scientific, and philosophical evidence for questions like, is there a God? What is that God like? Is this Bible at all reliable? Is this Jesus man ever rise from the dead? Things like that. But we're also a place for people with a lot of different backgrounds and faiths to come together and just have some really interesting discussion on worldview and deep questions, and just we're a place to ask those hard questions that are pretty hard to ask other places. And we really encourage that. We really encourage that discussion and questioning of our faith, because we don't want to just have a blind faith, just have faith that we just believe because our parents told us to. You know, we want to find the truth, and whatever that truth is, to believe that, to make that leap of faith based on evidence, based on truth. And so that's really what we do here. We have different guest speakers come in every week, give different talks on topics that relate to that, and just continue to explore, you know, the reasons why we believe what we believe. Reasonable Faith officers, would you stand
Yes.
up for
Exist.
Just so everyone knows,
Right here.
it's Sarah, Kevin, and Josh. Here right now we have two.
It's also Kenneth.
There's
who
also
is not
Kenneth,
here right
who's
now.
currently disappeared.
Outside.
And
he's on a
Rob,
search and rescue
who
mission.
is-
Okay. Okay, and Rob currently has COVID. But if y'all have any other questions, feel free to just ask any of us.
Now I'm thinking about Rob. Sarah, can you turn off the microphone at all? He says it's hard to hear. 'Cause he's
Oh,
Oh.
Oh,
I don't know how to do that. Maybe I'll just bring
I
it
don't know if it's
closer.
an option either, but this is easy from texting.
I can try to talk louder.
Yes, try that, Seth.
Okay, louder.
Just-
Well, hopefully that's good, Rob.
Yell at the camera.
All right. So those are our leaders. If you have any questions about the organization, please ask any of us. Yeah. So I would like to also point out, though, that we, though we do operate pretty independently, we are a smaller chapter of a much larger organization, also called Reasonable Faith, founded by William Lane Craig. I don't know how many of you have heard of him, but he's a pretty well-known apologist. Cool.
A lot of people that have been there
The officers
before.
raise their hands.
But yeah. So kind of just a map of the different Reasonable Faith chapters. There's like 200 of them at this point, and we are just one of them. So we're part of a pretty big organization. We have a lot of independence, like we really don't work super closely with, you know, it's not like we're get handed down any kind of curriculum or anything, but still we are kind of tied to this pretty large conglomerate, which spans a pretty impressive amount of countries at this point. So yeah, also, just so everyone get to know each other, gonna have a bit of an icebreaker. When I called on, just please state your name, major, and something interesting. I will go first. I am Seth Rippentrop. And you can just say something.
Hello, Seth Rippentrop.
Yeah. I must refer to you as only that. For the rest of you. I'm a physics major, and something interesting about me is I have, at this point, 1,500 rubber ducks. This is just one of them, right here, and soon you will learn of them all.
The number just keeps growing.
All right, then. Good evening, everyone. My name is Bachit. I am a global business major. My hometown is Georgetown, Texas. And an interesting fact about myself is that I have 7 rabbits and 5 birds.
I'm Alan Hainline. Yeah, I'm not a student here, as you might have guessed. I could have been, sure. Yeah, I have a small software company. We do commercial satellite imaging, get into AI a bit. But I started these chapters, this chapter, I guess a dozen or so years ago. And it's been just a really fun time to meet a lot of really bright students and have interesting conversations and stuff like that. So I look forward to getting to know you all, and thanks for coming out.
My name is Ren. I'm currently undeclared, possibly political science. My hometown, Plano, Texas, and I once accidentally turned on a handheld blender when my finger was in it, and I had to get stitches. So if I ever say something in this club, you guys can feel free to think that person put their finger in a blender. Yeah, you're welcome.
Top that.
Hi, I'm Ashton. I'm a CS major. My hometown is Plano. One interesting thing, I'm learning about Oriental literature, specifically Persian literature. I didn't realize how much was in the UTD library, so now I'm reading Sadi of Shiraz. So I don't know how many of you know that name, but no, right off my ear. So yeah, I really like it. Yeah.
Cool.
My name is Andy. I'm a mathematics major, and I'm from Austin, and I like to play chess.
My name is Karis. I'm a mechanical engineering major. My hometown is mostly Wausau, Wisconsin. It changed recently, so I never know. And something interesting about me is that I hate pizza.
All of it?
Pretty much, yes.
Every kind?
Pretty much.
That is
I'm gonna ask you
unusual,
about that
yeah.
later.
Yeah.
We're gonna have a conversation.
When we have a pizza party next, we'll have to make sure we have an alternative for you there.
I mean, I can eat it because it's impossible to live in this country and not be able to eat pizza every so
Yeah.
often.
Especially being on the college campus.
Yeah.
But I won't enjoy it.
Okay, wow.
Hello, I'm Ariel, and I'm a mechanical engineering major, and I'm from Houston, and something that's like a hobby is I love to bake.
Wow.
I'm Sarah. I'm from Allen, Texas, and my major is child learning and development. And my absolute favorite restaurant in the whole entire world is In-N-Out. And the closest one here is 15 minutes away, and that's too far. There's one in Plano.
Oh, yeah.
And Sarah's getting married
Yes.
in November.
That is a more interesting thing about it.
Wait, how old are you?
20.
20? When did you meet?
We met my freshman year. He was actually the president of this club when I was a freshman, so that's how we met. Yeah.
One of several people that have met in this group, actually, so you never know.
Howdy, I'm Madeline. I'm a computer science major from Austin. Interesting fact, I like to crochet.
Cool.
I'm Kevin. I'm also a CS major, like a lot of people here. And my hometown is Richardson, and there's one interesting fact about me. Let's see. I really like cheese. Now something a little more interesting than that. I'm also an officer of the Comics for the Preborn. It's a abortion abolitionist or pro-life organization on campus. We'll be our meetings haven't started yet, but that'll start up in a couple of weeks here.
Interesting fact and shameless plug.
Yes.
That's right. Yeah. Anybody interested? Talk to Kevin.
I'm Caitlin. I'm a biology major, and I grew up in Wiley, Texas, and I really hate whipped cream.
I'm Josh. I'm an econ major. My hometown is Parker, about half an hour north of here. And my interesting fact is that 1,000 of those ducks that Seth is talking about, I purchased.
It is your fault. You have a duck right there.
So I understand you guys looked up the Guinness World Book of Records record, right? Are you going to try to beat that?
I believe the current record's about 5,000 something.
You gotta
I'm
wait
on my
till
way.
That's
She get 1,000 a year and
Yeah, exactly.
eventually get there.
As long as Josh keeps supplying me.
Where do you
Also-
keep them all?
In a giant bag at the current moment.
Also, Rob wants to participate, so he sent me his stuff as well. Rob is an electrical engineering major. He's from Houston-ish, and he has been helping me, sending Seth about half the ducks.
It's entire infrastructure.
It worked very well on his first day of school was it last year?
Yeah, it was last year.
Yeah, last year, we put 500 ducks in his room by the time he came back. This is Rob. I've been sent a picture.
Okay, so my name's David. I'm an A-Tech major. I'm from Plano, so I just commute here. And then, okay, I'll do a shameless plug. I'm an officer in Turning Point, USA. So that's my shameless plug.
Hello, I'm Jonathan. I'm a CS major. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri. So less hot there.
More humid.
Oh, but yeah. A fun fact is, as a kid, not anymore, but as a kid, I used to not like cheese.
You just give it all to Kevin.
My name is Mahad. I'm a computer science major, and my hometown is Rawalpindi in Pakistan. And as for a hobby, I like video editing.
Wow, awesome.
Hi, my name is Jeremiah. I'm a mechanical engineering major. I'm from Garland. And because this seems to be a theme, I can't eat cheese.
Wow. Cheesy group here, right? Cheesy group.
All right.
So you can, but choose not to.
So if we bring in a cheese pizza, we're going to be alienating 3 people at least here, and Kevin's going to go crazy.
Just my thing. Okay, fine.
The guy I'd like to ask Alan to come up here now to give his nice spiel. I'm leaving this duck here.
Thanks, Seth. You want our mascot or something here?
Sure, at this point.
So, let's see here. Yeah, I was going to just kind of talk through a few general things with you guys, give you a bit of a preview about the upcoming semester so that you'll want to come back. Show that we have some interesting speakers and topics and things like that. And at the end, we're going to have Seth give a little mini talk, sampler kind of thing on a really interesting argument for the existence of God and see what y'all think. But, you know, we are called reasonable faith. Maybe a good place to start is like, you know, answering the question, can faith be reasonable? Because, you know, some people would want to say faith by definition goes against reason or something like that, which it really doesn't, right? I think you could have a well-placed faith, or you could have an unreasonable faith, certainly. Some people do. You could be right and believe something without having good reasons for it. But it's always better, isn't it, if you've studied enough, if you've evaluated, searched for truth enough, that you have good reasons for what you believe in, right? So that's kind of what our group's all about. And we are a Christian group. We are, you know, what you'll see if you come here will be like a case for God or for Christianity. But we're more than happy if you don't believe it and you want to push back on it. In fact, a lot of times our Christians will, you know, we're trying to shoot holes in arguments too. We're trying to evaluate, like, does this really work? You know, maybe not everything we bring forward here is a good argument for God or Christianity. So we want to be evaluating that. Yay, with the search and rescue mission, we had success. Come on in, grab a seat. We're just kind of starting off with some intro. So for those who are Christians, you know, you can think about this famous verse, 1 Peter 3:15 tells us to always be ready to make a defense to anyone who asks you to give a reason for the hope that you have, but do it with gentleness and respect. And so that really is what our group's all about. We want to be able to disagree in an agreeable way, so to speak. Like, we want it to be this environment where you guys can ask any question. We can just, we're not going to all agree on everything. We're sort of a non-denominational group in that sense. And we've always had Hindus or atheists. We've at least had a few people from different backgrounds come to the group regularly. And we've always appreciated that. We always make them feel welcome because they help, frankly, a lot with the discussion because they can push back on things if we might have blind spots. So that's always appreciated. Couple other notes. Sometimes people think of Christianity a little bit as anti-intellectual. And to be honest, there has been a little bit of a move in America at certain points in time where sometimes there is a little bit of sort of anti-intellectualism within the church. Not all churches, but a few. And so I think I would like to make the case that, that doesn't really fit well with Christianity biblically. Because if you look, for example, Proverbs, it talks so much about wisdom, right? And the whole book of Proverbs and the importance of wisdom. If you look at the New Testament, it says test everything. Or like in Acts, it says the Bereans were more noble than the Thessalonians because they searched the scriptures to see if what Paul was saying was true. They didn't just take it by faith. They went and did the research to see if, was he really quoting the Old Testament right in terms of how it pointed to Jesus. So, I think we do need to love God with our mind as well, right? That's a key commandment. So if you're a Christian, those are some motivations. If you're not, just kind of maybe gives you some background, kind of where we're coming from a bit. That we do want to value the life of the mind, and we think that's really important, especially as we engage culture. We don't want to just expect people, hey, come to my church and believe in what I do because it's given me these good feelings or something. That doesn't always sell well with everybody, right? So we want to be able to show them that actually there is a lot of evidence for God. There's a pretty strong case you can make for Christianity historically and so forth. It is a somewhat unique in terms of religions that whether Christianity is true or not is based on historical claims. For example, Jesus raising from the dead. Paul himself said, if Christ is not raised, your faith is worthless. There's no point in being a Christian if Jesus didn't really rise from the dead. So, that's something you can explore historically. You may not be able to prove it, obviously not in any kind of mathematical sense, but you can evaluate the evidence. So that's an example of one of many things that we will look into in this group. So just some kind of questions to consider. We do live in a culture where people sometimes are more interested in meology than theology. Whatever feels good, maybe a smorgasbord approach to religion or spirituality. They'd much rather talk about spirituality than religion, right? So, maybe I like this thing that the Hindus do, and Jesus was kind of cool, but I don't fully buy into everything he said. But that doesn't really make sense, right? You really want to look at things from an evidential truth standpoint. If there's contradictory claims from different religions, they can't both be true. They could both be false theoretically, but they couldn't both be true. And so I think we want to just kind of think about those kind of things ourselves. Like, hey, this is the most important question there is. You're spending a lot of money to come here, get a good education that can help you in a lot of ways, but this is really the most important issue. If Christianity is true, then that's a huge thing that makes all the difference. If God exists, that's a big difference in the world than if God doesn't exist. And if you are able to kind of search out those kind of questions and come to evidence-based conclusions, it makes a huge difference. All right. So I would encourage everybody, if you're on a truth search, and it's great if you're here and you're not a Christian, that's fantastic. And I myself, for example, went through a period of doubts. I was talking to someone beforehand that was also mentioning that we have a long history of many people in the group have gone through either doubts or they just, they had a very non-Christian upbringing, and when presented with the evidence, they eventually became Christians and so forth. So we certainly welcome that. But think about it. A lot of people can be very rational, when they're in the science classroom, math, CS, whatever, but they don't always expend the same kind of mental energy evaluating the most important question, like, does God exist? Which religion is right? Why not, apply those same kinds of reasoning in that area? Make sure you have the right worldview spiritual beliefs about everything. So that's just kind of my 2 cents worth, anyway, to think about, encourage you to think about. Here is our upcoming schedule. So we do have it pretty well laid out. Seth is our president. He said, I usually kind of do the schedule with a lot of inputs from students. I have a few hard copies even you can take and we'll get it on. We have a version maybe.
Yeah, I believe it's.
We keep updating it in minor ways.
Yeah,
But
I
I will
think
give
the copy I
you
have
a
is
copy
kind of
and you can take pictures, and anybody that wants a old-fashioned hard copy is welcome to have it. All right, pass one back to the lady in the yellow shirt there, if you would.
Totally. Put that
And
picture on the
Caitlin.
Discord.
Yeah. So maybe I'll look at that while I'm going over there. I don't have to go back there.
Yeah, I'll take a picture of that.
All right, yeah, I'm going to go on some future slides
Yeah,
over
the group.
a few of the details. What's that?
You got Tim the group coming, that's cool.
Yeah. It's not 100% confirmed, but it's likely. We were pretty sure we're going to have him come down to the area. So yeah, he's been very well liked over the years by students. Really sharp philosophy professor from Western Michigan. Also very personable. He's one of these brilliant people. In fact, you said you liked chess, Andy. He was the chess champion of the state of Michigan. So he's really good. I think one time he played 10 people simultaneously blindfolded, according to my friend. Yeah, it's crazy. He's crazy smart, but yeah, he remembers all these books he's read and stuff. So, but he, for being so brilliant, he's really personable. So he's a good person to kind of walk that journey or ask really tough questions to, like we try to do in our group.
Also leading the group.
Yeah. His wife is also a PhD, really sharp lady that has some good books. So yeah, we'll talk through some of these as I go through the slides here, but I do want to highlight that we do have an upcoming science series starting in mid-September for 4 weeks. We're going to look at several different topics. So a bit of an intro about that area. I'm a physics major background person myself, so I've always been kind of interested in the sciences, even though I'm kind of doing more computer science-y type stuff now. So, a lot of people try to set up a dichotomy between like science and religion, right? So I saw this recently online. I thought it was pretty good. You've got Einstein and Pythagoras, fighting over the c-squared there. No, it's part of my equation. No, it's part of my equation. But obviously both equations are true, right? And in the same way, it's like, why do we set up science and faith as this kind of either or thing? It's really like you can have both, right? In fact, science was really founded by most of the pioneers of science were actually Christians, and it was no coincidence because they were looking for law in nature because they believed in the lawgiver. But that's a whole talk in and of itself if you really want to get into that. But anyway, so yeah, I don't think it really makes sense to set up this kind of false dichotomy where you have these at war. There really, in fact, you'll have secular historians that will admit there really never was this long warfare between science and religion. That's something that was concocted later by people trying to rewrite the history, actually. But there is some interesting things to think through here, right? Because science, by its very nature, you're studying nature, you're sort of limited to looking for natural causes. So it's really good in that domain, right? It's great at detecting natural causes. But it's not really geared towards deciding, is there something beyond nature? I mean, that's out of its purview, right? The people that are scientists, they're not trained in philosophy of religion, arguments for the existence of God from philosophy, things like that. So they're not really used to even thinking in those terms. And if they try to look for, actually there was some Russians years ago that when they first sent out people in orbit around the Earth and stuff, being a communist state, they said something to the effect of like, hey, there's no God, we went up into outer space and we didn't see him. And I always thought, well, if you did see a God there, then that would just prove Christianity, because we don't believe in a God floating around the earth in some physical form anyway. So, yeah, sometimes there's some mischaracterization. But I do like to think of it in the analogy of like a metal detector. So a metal detector is really great at detecting metals, but I mean, if I had one here and I was going around and I said there's no plastic below this carpet or something, I mean, that's the wrong tool for that assessment, right? I mean, there could easily be something under the carpet that it's not going to ping off of due to the nature of its technology. You know, but that being said, it's also interesting to think about, well, wait a minute, if Christianity is true, then God did bring about the world. There may be differences of opinion or understanding about how he brought about the detailed aspects, but there's probably going to be some evidence that he left. And in fact, the Bible itself claims the heavens are telling the glory of God and things like that. So I think there is evidence. I'm convinced there's actually pretty strong evidence. But, you know, admittedly, it's not proof, and it's also something that brings in philosophy as well. You don't get a direct detection of God through any kind of natural processes. But yeah, one of the interesting questions is, well, how would you detect design scientifically if it's there at all? And for that, we're very pleased to announce, actually, that we have one of the world's foremost, probably the leading person you would want in the world to talk on that topic, Dr. Bill Dembski, coming to speak September 14th. He wrote this well-known Cambridge University Press book called The Design Inference, and it happened to be coming out with, like, 20 years later, there's like a second edition book of it. But he's going to come to our campus, to the SSA auditorium, bring your friends, start promoting it. Sarah made this really cool poster here, so we're getting that printed up, and you might see some of those around campus. But yeah, he's going to speak to this question, and you know, they show the Mount Rushmore here because that's a good example where you immediately detect design. Even if you're from a foreign country and you're not familiar with those presidents, you don't need to be to say, look, this doesn't look like this was the product of random acts of nature. It cries out for a deeper explanation. It looks like it was designed. How do you do that? There's a certain intuition you can have, but how do you make that mathematically rigorous? So Dembski was particularly well suited to do that because he has a PhD in both math and philosophy, and he really specialized and thought through this over a number of years. And then, yeah, as I mentioned, he had this book published. Cambridge University in the UK, it's probably the top science university in all of Europe. And so the fact that they published this book is pretty significant, I think. So he's a really good speaker too, great guy. So I hope you'll come to that and bring friends. Also, as part of this series, the next week, Dr. Rick Townsend is going to give a talk, a more introductory level on science and faith. Two sides of the same coin is his topic. And then on the 28th, I'm going to give my favorite topic presentation. That would be on fine-tuning. So this is an argument from physics, looking at the very foundational levels of science and asking, is there something special about that looks designed? And what we've come to understand, and as it mentions here, skeptics admit this is probably the strongest argument for God, or many of them do anyway. They don't quite know what to do with this argument. But we've discovered over the past 50 years or so, the science community, that is, not me personally, but that if you look at the laws of nature, the constants in those laws, and like the initial conditions, those all have to be very finely tuned, or you would not have any possibility of life anywhere in the universe. So that itself, I think, kind of cries out for some deeper explanation. I think design is the best explanation of that evidence, but at least that's the case I'll make there. You can decide if you think it's successful. Shown here are a couple of books. I did co-author a chapter in this book with Dr. Luke Barnes, who wrote this. This is probably the best book on that topic around. A lot of people will say that. It's also Cambridge University Press. And he got a PhD in physics from Cambridge, as well as his co-author. His co-author is an atheist, and he's a Christian, but in the book, most of the book is just like the physics of fine-tuning, and they agree on everything in those first 6 chapters of the book. And then the 7th chapter, Luke makes the case for God as the best explanation, and his atheist co-author makes the case for a multiverse, which is getting really popular in the movies these days. So anyway, that's going to be, I think, an interesting talk. that you'll want to make as part of that series. And then the next week, we're going to talk about near-death experiences, which I thought I should talk about this a little bit because you see that on there. I don't want you to think, oh, this group is kooky or something, or they're going off into fringe areas, but this is really more mainstream than you might realize. And within that, the set of claims, I mean, basically what they've discovered is that it's very widespread that people that are clinically dead, maybe as many as about 50%, have some kind of so-called near-death experience. And it has all these different phenomena, like you're looking down a tunnel or this or that. But what we're really going to focus on in this talk is just a subset of reports where there's like some evidential basis.
Like veridical?
Yeah, where you have some way of checking, like if they say they saw heaven and whatever they say they saw, I can't check it. It doesn't, we're only going to look at things where it's like, wait a minute, let me show you. We're looking at cases where what they report could be verified. For example, you could have cases where they were their heart wasn't even beating or something like that, or in a few cases they didn't even have brainwave activity, or they drained their blood out during some really wild things where there's no way they should know what the surgeons were talking about or the instruments they used, or all these details that they later report. And so it's gotten the attention of like people that don't even believe in God, that are neurosurgeons or something. They've started to document this. There's actually our peer-reviewed science journals trying to document some of these near-death experiences. People are trying to evaluate them. So it's an interesting phenomenon worth discussing, I think, and at least the subset that have some way of checking, like, okay, how do I know you didn't just make this up? Well, this is a good example here, right, in this bullet. Blind people, there's been a few cases where someone was blind, they had a near-death experience, but they reported things that they could see, but they never could see in the past, present, or future. And so it points to some possibility that there's something that transcends life on this earth. So, I mean, you can make what you want of it. You could say somehow maybe, somebody was in on it, it was all part of the scam, But anyway, those are the kinds of things we're going to discuss and look at. Well, what are some of these claims where there's evidence for them? Also, just one last, and then we'll move on. But there's one drowning victim, a girl named Katie. She lacked a pulse for 19 whole minutes. They really thought she was dead, but she reported an amazing wealth of information regarding the emergency room, details of her resuscitation, and she was able to describe the physicians who worked with her. So just kind of some interesting things like that. You'll find that week interesting. Bo Bishop, the guy giving the talk, is a really good communicator who's researched this a lot. We are going to get into, so we have in our group, we're going to have some science stuff, we're going to have some philosophy, and we're also going to have some history. As Seth mentioned, how do you evaluate the Bible in terms of, could it be God's word? How would you evaluate that? What are some evidence that it looks like it might have been inspired? Is it accurate? There's a lot of people that attack the Bible, so we want to look at, responses to some of those challenges, some of those objections. Is there a contradiction in a certain place, or things of that nature? So we're going to have talks on the internal and the external evidence. There's a bit more about Dr. McGrew, who I already mentioned. But yeah, he's really knowledgeable guy, and he knows a lot about the history, the way that New Testament intersects with history quite well. So just briefly then, in closing, in terms of the what the year holds, I wanted to mention next week, because I especially hope you guys will come back next week, because we want to look at this question of how can we evaluate Christianity using non-Christian sources. Now, in the talk, I am going to make the case that this is sometimes overemphasized by skeptics, like just because we have these 4 Gospels written by people who were Christians, we can't just totally dismiss them. I mean, most of the things written about baseball are written by baseball enthusiasts. If there really was a Jesus who rose from the dead, and people saw that, they might very well become Christians, And then you can't just dismiss them because they're Christians now.
You'd think that if the evidence were compelling, that people who see it and interact with it and report on it are persuaded by it.
Exactly. But at the same time, I will try to give you some things that you don't really hear in church, right? That's part of what our group likes to do is like, we're going to show you some evidence or some things you might not know, but give you more reasons for being confident that Christianity is true. Well, if you are a Christian anyway, or, give you a reason to consider Christianity if you're not. So I'm going to talk about Tacitus, and I'm going to talk about Josephus on the left, and this is Pliny the Younger, I believe, in the middle there. So some interesting, well-respected historians, none of them Christians. They wrote a lot of details about the New Testament. We can compare also Jesus to other religious figures in terms of how much, historical support we have for it. By the way, there are some Jesus skeptics out there that say he never lived.
Over 9,000 manuscripts or 50,000 manuscripts of the New Testament are up there. And I think there's only two of Thucydides. I don't think he's in war. So.
Yeah, there's some double standards going on some of those things. So, yeah, but some of the Jesus skeptics will say, well, there's not enough books talking about Jesus, and they'll point to like some gardening book or some book in some other part of the Roman Empire or something. It's like, come on, that doesn't make any sense. But I'm not even going to read through all this, but this is also just kind of a sampling of things. I stole this from Frank Turek. Seth and I went to some training that he gives. He actually encourages you to use slides he makes available, but it just kind of lists some of the interesting facts that you get evidence for from outside the Bible. And so we'll look at what history does report, why it's significant. For example, that you have people saying that the brother of Jesus died a martyr's death. Okay, so like if he would be in a position to know if there was certain lies, right, about the family, virgin birth, or things like that, the resurrection. So anyway, that's what's going to happen next week. But I want to turn it back now over to Seth so he can go over this really interesting argument. Yes. Let's see. All right. Now for my nerdy stuff. All right. So, what do y'all think is one of the oldest debates between atheists and Christians? Some may say, oh, maybe it's evolution, or others, and maybe something like separation of church and state. But the real answer is, it's more so the age of the universe. And real quick, I am not talking about old Earth, young Earth. I'm not even getting close to touching that. I'm not touching that. I'm talking about something much more fundamental. Is the universe a finite age or infinite age? Because, you see, for the longest time, the consensus was that the universe was eternal. Forever in the past, forever in the future, not changing on large scales at all. It just was, it just is, it just exists, no explanation required. And that was fine, for a while. For the secular thinkers you're talking about, right? Yes. Many of the secular thinkers. Top ones, yeah. However, things started to change in the 20th century. It started with Einstein's equations, the solutions to them. And they showed that the universe had to either be expanding or contracting, but not staying still. And so in that play, it's really hard to have an eternal universe if you have something that's expanding out or contracting in the future. It's got to either have a beginning in the past or an end in the future. Further evidence, though, came when astronomer Edwin Hubble discovered galactic redshift. And what he showed from this is that pretty much all the galaxies outside our own were moving away from us. But the ones that were close, were moving away slowly. And the ones that were farther away were moving away faster. And so if you clock it back, you can show that at some point in the finite past, every single galaxy in the universe was right on top of each other in one location. So that's very strange. And so people began to formulate the Big Bang Theory, that the entire universe expanded outward
from one single point in the finite past. Further corroboration for this came with cosmic microwave background radiation. If the Big Bang had happened, it was expected that there would be this afterglow of kind of this after heat glow of the explosion, quote unquote. And indeed, we found it in the 60s, and it conformed very, very closely to what predictions were made. But so at this point, we have a universe where matter and energy are expanding from some single point in the past. But what about space and time? Well, physicist Stephen Hawking and Nobel laureate Roger Penrose explored this question and came to the conclusion that in the Big Bang, not only would there be a beginning of matter and energy, there would also be a space-time singularity. And this constitutes the beginning of time and space itself. So at that point, you have practically every single constituent part of the universe coming into existence in the finite past. And even Stephen Hawking himself admitted that there is a singularity in the past that constitutes, in some sense, the beginning of the universe. Now, there's an objection one can make to this. This theory was built on Einstein's theory of gravity, which, admittedly, it works great for planet-sized stuff. It does not work very good for small scale. And that's a big problem in physics that we're trying to figure out. We still have not figured it out yet. It doesn't work good for small scale. So you could make the objection that as you're looking back at a smaller and smaller universe, eventually it gets to the point where these conclusions break down a little bit. And that's why, separately, there was the Born-Lincoln theorem, which really only made one assumption, that the universe was on average expanding, which again, from the redshift, the case. And if that was true, they showed that there had to be a beginning in the past for all models that conform to that. And this applies to universe models. This also applies to multiverse models as well. I'm not going to get into the multiverse, but it can be applied to many of those because they rely on expanding fields. And so physicist and atheist and Alexander Lincoln admitted that cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. Now, in addition to this, just a completely separate line of reasoning I want to share is the second law of thermodynamics. So, for all the non-physics majors out there, second law of thermodynamics states that entropy in a closed system always increases. Entropy is a measure of disorder. And it can kind of be thought of as a measure of like how much usable work is left. But you know, the sun today was shining out there. It's been shining way too much. Way too much. But that's energy still coming down. We can harvest that energy in solar panels. We can use it. Usable energy still exists. That sun is in a more ordered state, and it is radiating out its heat into a less ordered state, us. And so clearly there are hot spots and there are cold spots in the universe. There are stars and there are intergalactic space. We're clearly not at a point of total disorder. That point will come quadrillions of years into the future. Even the stars themselves will burn out. And eventually the universe would get to a point where it's just a cosmic soup of particles all at the same temperature, doing the same thing. It's the same everywhere. I'll cover questions at the end. Keep it in mind though. So it would get to a point of maximum entropy. It's clear we're not at that point yet. So if we are in an eternal universe, why hasn't that happened yet? That shouldn't have happened a year ago. That shouldn't have happened a million years ago. That should have happened eternally into the past. And yet we observe a universe like this and not this. So, okay, let's concede maybe the universe did have a finite beginning. What if it just came from nothing? What if it just popped into existence? This is roughly what Loren Krauss tries to argue in his A Universe from Nothing. However, in order to make the theory work, he relies on quantum fields and quantum mechanics in order to generate a universe from just random fluctuations. The bad thing is this presupposes the existence of quantum fields, of quantum mechanics, and of space and time to actually make those equations work. And so that's not nothing. That's still something. If anything, he's just sidestepping the problem to something before. Sure, he's explained how the universe got there, but how did the quantum fields get there? And more fundamentally, how did physics even come about? And so, even Krauss has admitted that he really didn't provide a satisfactory answer to why there was something rather than nothing, given that he really didn't propose nothing. Because again, quantum fields are not nothing. So, from this, we can start to apply an argument, the Kalam cosmological argument. And it goes something like this. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. Again, even attempts to show that the universe came to exist without a cause still rely on some kind of cause. That is quite intuitive and fundamental to just how logic works.
All of science is really based on that first
All of
premise.
science, because everything we do in science just breaks down if that's not true. Two, the universe began to exist. That's why I spent most of this talk trying to convince you. So, therefore, the universe has a cause. And the universe couldn't have just self-caused, because causes have to be outside of that object. It's logically inconsistent to say that something can just be the cause of itself. So, now we have some kind of causal entity that exists outside the universe. And so that's exactly what I proposed, a causal entity. And we know a few things about this entity. It must not be made of matter and energy, because those came into existence in the universe. It has to be outside the universe. It must not be bound within the universe or bound within space and time. And it must also be immensely powerful to create a universe. The universe is quite sizable. That would be a pretty big task. Have a degree of reason to just decide to create a universe. Be immensely intelligent in order to craft the universe in a way for it to work. That especially applies if we're assuming this entity also decided how physics was going to operate. But most importantly, from that not being bound within space-time, we get that it's timeless and eternal. This entity really sounds a whole lot like any conventional idea of God.
The G word.
So, now, the question immediately rises though, who created God? Because I just spent this entire time showing that the universe had to have a cause. Well, doesn't God have to have a cause? Can't we just keep saying, oh, there must be another God, another God, another God? No. If the universe was eternal, it wouldn't need a cause. Eternal things don't need a cause. They can just exist. And if the universe really was eternal, I wouldn't be here right now. I could have left 10 minutes ago. The problem is, it really seems like the universe is finite in age. And at that point, you can apply the cosmological argument. It really screams out, where did it come from? And so, at some point, to avoid an infinite regress, you gotta stop it with some kind of eternal thing somewhere. And by all, ideas of God, they usually are some kind of eternal being.
And that idea that you're talking about, this idea, this concept of the unmoved mover that you're referring to, is also really, really old philosophically as well. And a lot of this evidence that you're talking about is fairly recent in the realm of naturalistic science, but the concepts philosophically are all very old and even.
Good point. Yeah.
Sorry, I mean,
he's kind of giving the science argument aspect, and more could be said philosophically.
So, no one created God. It just wasn't necessary. You just can't apply this question to such a being. So, in conclusion, from a temporally finite universe, we can see that there was a cosmic beginning. And if there was a cosmic beginning, from that, through the Kalam argument, we get that there was a cosmic cause. And that cosmic cause had to be outside the cosmos, had to be outside the universe. And so again, we run into this idea of something very powerful and beyond our universe, which is a whole lot like God. So how then can we say, as the great atheist Carl Sagan said, that the universe is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be? Our contemplations of the cosmos stir us. Because if there is something so far beyond that, so great as to make the entire universe, then how much more will our contemplations of that stir us, even beyond seeing the great and wonderful cosmos through our telescopes?
Yeah, the irony is that science has just proven a statement that the universe hasn't been around forever. So,
all right, questions? Yes.
She had it first.
Yeah, so I think where you lost me was a couple slides ago with when you said that it had to have reason and it had to been immensely intelligent. I mean, I'm sure y'all have heard the argument before. I just like to hear it like this explanation is like response to it. We have a universe that we can explore and look at and understand the physics of because it was able to create life. I mean, we wouldn't have a universe if the physics didn't work in a way where we could exist to look at it. So there had to be some pretty precise planning. Oh my gosh, kill me now. No, there had to be some pretty precise like rules in place which made it possible for us to exist, right? So I guess in that sense, how do we know that there had to, because there could possibly be a million other universes which failed or weren't able to be to exist. So we're working from the assumption of the only universe that we have to look at is the one that worked out enough to create us, right?
True. I mean, granted, the multiverse is a whole different topic.
Yes.
That particular question sounds more relevant, like when I give the fine-tuning talk.
Yeah, I was about to say that.
Okay, I'll
You
ask
have like
next.
an observer selection effect. You can only find yourself in a life-permitting universe, and you have to look at.
I will say though that, yeah, a lot of that does rely on there existing a bunch of other universes. But even with a lot of those multiverse models, the BGB theorem still applies, and a lot of them still seem to require some kind of finite point in the past. So again, the question is raised, where did the multiverse come from?
And then I guess my second question would be, why can't we apply those things, like, so let's say, I have no idea what the hell a quantum field is. But like,
no problem.
Theoretically, you know, I definitely agree that it makes sense that if everything must have a cause, there must be something that is eternal. But why can't that thing be like, quantum fields are something that isn't God? I guess that's where I'm like, because I think those.
Can I build on that? Like, aren't we sort of anthropomorphizing God when we say he has reason? So, like, in other words, if God has reason, is it analogous to our reason? So does he just have human reason, but to an infinite degree?
That's maybe a separate
more of a
question.
Theological question that isn't quite.
Well, because that does raise a question, because it's the difference between a personal God and an impersonal God, like the God of the Bible versus a more deistic conception.
True, and honestly, this is so broad level that I wouldn't even say this rules out a deistic God. Like, there's a lot of gods. The only thing that this rules out is a pantheistic God, or at least as an explanation for this, because pantheistic God would be bound within the universe.
Or naturalism, of course.
Or naturalism.
Yeah. But maybe we should get back to Rin's
yeah,
question
I
first,
will
because that was
say
a little
though-
bit different, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I will say though that, you know, the quantum uncertainty that can just create things, it's hard to think about when you get like those infinities in there. But like, if you do just have this field that is capable of just creating the universe, it's kind of by definition unstable. Like, it's going to do something at some point. And so if it has been existing for eternity, then wouldn't it create a universe eternally into the past because it would have had infinite chances? And we hit the question of why we're not at maximum entropy yet.
Well, aren't there theories that kind of look into that? I don't know.
Let me comment on that maybe, because I mean, I think your question was a good one, and it is. It's actually what the secular thinkers thought for forever. They thought, okay, matter's been around forever, so we don't need God. You know, the universe is just, if it's been forever, because if the first premise is not whatever exists has a cause, but whatever begins to exist. So if all the matter in the universe didn't begin to exist then you could plausibly at least say in this area you don't have a good argument for God. But when we found out that you had to have a beginning to matter, energy, space, and time, I mean, if that's true, you can argue against it. It's maybe not 100%, but there's some very compelling evidence from what he presented to say that you can't say that matter has been around forever, or even space-time. And that's where you lose all the resources for creating universes apart from God. If you don't even have space, time, matter, and energy, you need something non-physical, I think, at that point.
I think, oh, yes.
You can go if you want to.
I like the discussion, the back and go ahead, jump in there with some thoughts.
Okay, I like the explanation of the Kalam cosmological argument. I think you presented it well. With the Big Bang Theory, you presented that also well. So it's the idea that since the universe is expanding, that it has to be expanding from one single point, then on that single point it's called the singularity. So I'm pretty sure with our understanding of physics now, we understand there are four fundamental forces in physics. The strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, the gravitational force, and the electromagnetic force. We can understand these forces used to be unified into the singularity like all the galaxies. They were put into one thing, in the singularity. We don't understand how to quantize gravity on like its most fundamental level. That's why we can't understand the singularity, because there's a piece of it that we don't have an understanding of. So space and time, as we know it today, started at t equals 10 to the negative 43rd power. That's a really weird equation, but what it basically means is space and time as we know it today. The Planck epoch. This is the explanation of when the universe started expanding.
Like a minuscule duration after zero is what you're saying.
Minuscule duration after zero. That's super small.
Science can't say anything beyond that.
Beyond
That's
that.
the whole point.
Because we can't comprehend it. But my question is, does the Big Bang Theory propose that there was a beginning to existence, or just a beginning to space and time as we know it? There's nothing in the Big Bang Theory that posits that the singularity had a beginning also. It just posits that space and time as we know it has a beginning at t equals 10 to the negative 43rd power. We don't know anything before that, so we can't propose that that is a zero.
I think the key thing in Seth's presentation, it did have to go, as you said, kind of beyond the Big Bang. I think the Bourdet-Bellington-Guth theorem and the second law are what really gets you to the point of saying, even if there is some universe generating mechanism, and so our universe came about through some natural process, that there's very good reasons from science, not proof, but good reasons for thinking that the universe as a whole, even if it's a multiverse, had a beginning in the finite past.
Yeah, I just wanted to, like, the specific point that I thought was most important is that space and time as we know it had a beginning, but we don't know if all things, we can't conclusively say that before space and time started was nothing. So we don't know if there was a temporary finite universe. We just don't know what happened before space and time as we know it began to formulate themselves.
I mean, in some sense, as a Christian, I would say, yeah, God has a different notion, right, of space. He could have other domains, right, of existence or whatever. But I think physically, though, you could say that on the BVG theorem, that's really talking about all of space-time having a beginning.
Yeah,
and that is pretty radical.
And what really would even be there.
That's not,
If it's a different form of space-time, then assumedly it still probably operates at least by similar physics and maybe different constants.
The problem for me is the assumption. The assumption is something that we wouldn't be able to know. So building a foundation off of an assumption is like building a house on sand.
Well, I think the BVG is stronger than that.
I don't know what the BVG is. I've never heard of it until today, so I'll look into it.
Let me just say one thing. I'd argue that pretty much all science is built off of assumptions.
I agree.
So
it's
built off of math. Math is on axioms.
Pretty much all assumptions. I mean, we're assuming right now we're not Boltzmann membrane floating in the void and that we exist. So everything's built off of assumptions. Yes.
Well, I was just gonna say, like, whatever preceded the universe couldn't have been anything, like in a corporeal sense. It would have had to be transcendental, and that has more to do with ontology. So you have like math, and you have concepts which are transcendental, which don't have any form. So whatever existed before space couldn't have occupied space. It would have had to be formless, like mathematical concepts like physics. I think that it does describe God as well as a transcendental.
Yeah, it had to be formless, transcendental, but still having causal power, which abstract objects like you're describing don't have causal power.
That's a good
What
point.
about-
That's worth noting, that I think if I understand your point very well, even though I'm not a physicist, yes, we don't know what happens beyond this Planck's constant of time, but as soon as we begin to articulate what that thing must be that would have triggered the beginning of space-time at that singularity, and we assign and we begin to figure out what attributes this trigger must have had, even though we don't know exactly what it is, we begin to build attributes onto it that work to be able to create a trigger for space-time at this particular time, but also look quite a bit like God.
I think the only thing that I'll say right now that is like kind of making me hesitant is the idea that we're presupposing that we can logically explain using logic that we understand today things that are fundamentally entirely different. Like what you said with quantum mechanics, you can't explain quantum mechanics with general relativity. But general relativity works everywhere else in the universe, except when you get to the quantum. So we can't use logic we use on the macro scale to explain things that we can't even fundamentally understand. We see in physics that things on a larger scale and things on the quantum scale are like, I think Einstein called it spooky action. Like he got quantum mechanics spooky action from a distance. Like it was something that the smartest person on the planet at the time was like, this is incomprehensible to the smartest person on the planet. So trying to rationalize these things with logic that works today to work on things that, like we can't even do that with the science.
Well, there's nothing illogical about quantum mechanics, but yeah, it bothered Einstein because he didn't expect it. I think, like entangled quantum particles, once you measure this, all of a sudden this one attains a certain property. So it is absurd if you're expecting it to be just like classical physics, but
it's still something that's governed by physics. Like it's not just complete off-the-wall randomness that has no rhyme or reason.
yeah, it still obeys the laws of logic and so forth.
Yeah,
But you're right that we don't have a quantum theory of gravity. That's just sort of unknown.
Yeah, certainly, and perhaps future science quantized theory.
So that's going to solve that with the Nobel Prize.
But we can't just appeal to future science that like, oh, maybe it might explain things just because it's a bit of an of the gaps reasoning. But I totally understand what you're saying, and certainly, yeah, looking back at the beginning of the Big Bang is certainly a drastically different place than we are now. But I will say, at least with logic, I feel like logic is at, just like logic in general, is at I'd argue it's at a level that's a lot more fundamental than just physics. That I feel like that would hold even in an absurdly small before Planck time.
Really? Do you think that there's like anything in quantum mechanics that's illogical?
No, I don't think you could draw any.
There's a lot that's counterintuitive, but it doesn't violate the laws of
Maybe
logic.
it appears non-deterministic, but that doesn't mean that it's illogical necessarily. Like, there's not.
It may even be deterministic.
Yeah, I mean, you have equations that are deterministic, but
that doesn't mean that it truly is.
I mean, we assume it's all random, but that is kind of at bottom a mathematical assumption that maybe overdone. Again, now I'm appealing to things, so
I was just bringing it up
because it's a good point. It's good points of discussion.
Yeah. But yeah, sorry.
I will note, when you were talking about when you were describing the thing that created the universe, and you described it as reasonable because it had to be in order to create life. That almost got me thinking about The Game of Life by John Conway, and how through a very simple instruction set, you can get these very complicated and even self-replicating things in them. I guess that also kind of gets into the fine-tuning argument.
Yeah, or even just intelligent design.
Yeah, we should talk about that in the fine-tuning week, because Luke Barnes talks about that in his book, Conway's Game of Life.
Yeah, and presenting this without fine-tuning as well, they're kind of two sides a bit of the same thing, so they do kind of lean on each other a bit, so it's a little incomplete by just saying this. But.
I know you want to reserve this for the fine tuning week. So just very quickly, how would you rebut the multiverse argument? Like what flaws are there in the multiverse?
Wow, yeah, I did a whole talk on the multiverse last year. Did you go that week or?
Yeah,
I can send you the
PowerPoint.
Do you want? Go ahead. You want to respond to his?
I'm gonna steal one of your metaphors. I think
Okay.
Going back to what Ren said earlier about since we exist, then obviously it's the universe is fine-tuned. It kind of assumes that we exist. And the analogy was if you're in front of a firing squad, and you have like 10 people fire at you, and then they fire and you're still alive. On the one hand, you can say that, well, if you weren't alive, then you wouldn't be around to be surprised, so you shouldn't be surprised. But on the other hand, you shouldn't assume that you're still around to be, so it does still make sense to be surprised and look for an answer other than just random chance.
You're surprised they all missed, right? It looks like there might have been something going on that was designed, like they're firing blanks, they missed on purpose, something like that. So there is an example, yeah, where you have like a survival selection effect, but it still cries out for a deeper explanation. In a nutshell, the multiverse, it's all based on very speculative physics. We have no evidence for any universe other than our own. It's become so popular in the movies and everything that's like, people are just going to assume it has to exist. But yeah, I mean, the thing is, even if there was a multiverse, you would have to look at the predictions of the theory and still see if it gets away with fine-tuning. We find fine-tuning at every level. There's no reason to think it goes away. If you have a universe generating mechanism, it probably requires fine-tuning to spit out a bunch of universes. I don't think it's going to solve the problem. It's sort of the bottom line. And the thing that
it's got to be capable of producing universes that all have different parameters. So
yeah, you don't just need a bunch of them. You need the variance of the constants of nature to solve the problem.
And the initial conditions.
And the initial conditions. Yeah, Penrose, the Nobel laureate that Seth mentioned, he talked a lot about the fine-tuning of the initial conditions, and this is relevant to this as well because the early universe had to have just a certain arrangement of particles or it would have resulted in basically all black holes with no possibility of life. So if you're doubting, and admittedly this argument is not a proof, it's not 100%, it's just the best physics points to a beginning and then you've got a pretty good argument. Okay, but you now have the situation where the early universe looks so improbable as though it were designed for a goal to avoid black holes and allow structure formation in the universe.
Seth, that's a really big number you've got written on the board. What's that mean?
The level of fine-tuning.
Yeah, I was going to mention that's what Penrose calculated.
Go ahead and tell them that. Yeah, the level of fine-tuning in the initial conditions.
So like, that's the odds basically. It's like
one in that
thing. That's
a double exponent it's evaluated first up top, so it's like.
So that is more zeros. If you wrote it out in standard form, that is more zeros than there are atoms in the universe.
The reason I bring him up is he said the multiverse is worse than useless for explaining the initial conditions of the fine-tuning in that area. Because if you had some kind of multiverse generator, it would generate small universes that are easier to fine-tune, but we have this huge one. There's a bunch of technical details that I think we're better off just going to Taco Bell at this point. But we can talk more of the fine-tuning week about that in particular, or offline at Taco Bell tonight if you want.
Yeah. If I could maybe add a very brief thing about that, and maybe it's helpful to you, and I'm not sure if it is, but say that this is one of many universes, right? This universe displays the properties of not being self-existent, right? It doesn't exist on its own power. Like we used to, secular philosophers used to believe, but it's not been scientifically disproven. That's what Seth was talking about. Even if there is a multiverse, and this is one of many universes, those other universes also wouldn't have those self-existent properties. So even if we have a multiverse that exists, that multiverse doesn't have the ability to explain where any of it came from. It does ultimately put us back where we started. That requires something that is indeed a universe-generating mechanism, like everybody's talking about. And as we try to characterize that one more time, it becomes pretty godlike.
Yeah. I would just say my feedback as an incredibly sleep-deprived atheist, as peaceful as that might be to you, is just, I think the jump, like, you lost me when you were listing, like, the properties. Because I think a lot of this is going to be what you're going to talk about next week about fine-tuning. But some of it just, as a person who didn't grow up with God and, talk about it or explain it around me, first of all, putting the label of God on there, like, is already, God holds a lot of weight, especially in a place like this where we're talking about Christianity specifically, so we already have an idea of what, like, when we say God, we think Christian God, right? But I think also there are some things that I'm, like, already agreeing with, eternal. I don't know the exact definition of transcendental, but depending on how you define it, I think that might also work. But I think just breaking it down a little bit.
That's really
Not as
good
many
feedback.
jokes.
Thank you for that. And the fine tuning, it's a little further down in the schedule, but.
Yes.
Yeah.
I promise this is another blunder. It's fine.
Oh, yeah.
How are we on time right now?
It is 8:20.
8:21.
We might want to head over, yeah.
I think we said
Alrighty.
this goes to.
Yeah.
All right, well,
Well,
And I think we are about.
we did